O sea, sí, la madre de todas las ciencias. Y hoy día ha sido relegada particularmente porque hay un interés de que la gente no tenga pensamiento crítico, es decir, que no sepa poder, que no tenga la capacidad real de diferenciar la verdad del error. Muchos se preocupan de las fake news. Yo no me preocupo de las fake news. Es más, creo que cada uno tiene que formar su criterio para poder saber qué le cree y qué no le cree. Y para eso hay que tener pensamiento crítico. Para eso hay que saber filosofía. O sea, precisamente eso que está votado es probablemente lo más importante. No solo para poder diferenciar la verdad del error, sino que también para poder orientar la vida a lo que cada uno de ustedes busca en el fondo de su alma. Yo me imagino que todos los que están aquí quieren ser felices. Si hay alguien que no quiere ser feliz, que vaya al psiquiatra porque tiene un problema, definitivamente. Es más, sí, las humanidades, eso que nos sirve para nada inmediato, para nada práctico, digamos, con esa visión de la educación hoy día de habilidades. ¿Qué es eso de habilidades? La principal habilidad es saber pensar. Nosotros somos seres racionales. Sí, somos personas, humanas, únicas e irrepetibles. Somos libres, pero tenemos razón. Y sin la razón no somos capaces de orientar nuestra voluntad. Es la razón la que debe orientar la voluntad. Y es en ese sentido que es importante poder conocer a Adam Smith. Porque Adam Smith no es solo una persona que hable de economía, sino que podríamos decir en amplio rango y sin que existiese, es un sociólogo, sí. No existía la sociología, unas comillas, ciencia, si se la puede llamar así, muy moderna y muy compleja, porque hace supuestamente ciencia de un algo no existente, de un constructo, que es la sociedad. Porque la sociedad no es algo concreto como ustedes ni como esta agua, sino que es una construcción mental, es precisamente un fruto del pensamiento y de la filosofía. Y lo que hace Adam Smith es pensar el mundo, pensar cómo funciona el mundo, cómo funcionan las personas y cómo lograr que distintas personas que por naturaleza se preocupan primero de ellos y después de su entorno cercano, se puedan preocupar de los demás. Lo que hace Adam Smith es tratar de teorizar cómo lograr que personas que no tienen un vínculo afectivo puedan trabajar y lograr que todos estén mejor. Por lo tanto, sí, su obra es una obra social que busca, y el profesor Miller les va a aclarar mucho más, aclarar particularmente y orientar principalmente a los políticos. El gran problema es cuando la política se aleja de la filosofía, en el momento que dejamos los consejos de ancianos. ¿Por qué los consejos de ancianos? Porque en la medida que vamos creciendo surge, sí, de acuerdo, nos vamos deteriorando físicamente, pero nos ponemos mucho más sabios. Yo les pregunto a todos ustedes, si cada uno de ustedes se encontrara con ustedes mismos de 18 años y tuvieran una conversación, ¿con cuál se quedan? Con el de hoy día, obvio. Ya, la vida es irónica y efectivamente la sabiduría es algo importante. Y por eso la filosofía es importante. Yo quiero situar a nuestro personaje y antes de presentar a nuestro invitado, porque hoy no me vinieron a escuchar a mí, quiero situar a nuestro personaje. Estamos hablando de Escocia, y uno diría Escocia, pequeña, hoy 5 millones de habitantes. Sí, muy pequeño, en un lugar remoto. Recién hablábamos, posiblemente yo he guiado muchos viajes a Escocia, es un lugar que yo adoro en la tierra, un lugar precioso, pero sí, demográficamente bastante deshabitado. Lo que podemos garantizar es que ahí sobra el agua. Cuando dicen falta el agua, no, ahí sobra el agua. Pero efectivamente Escocia, lo que más ha exportado al mundo son escoceses. Hay más escoceses fuera de Escocia que en Escocia. Y Escocia va a ser un lugar que nosotros no lo tenemos en la retina porque cuando nosotros pensamos en la historia y en la historia europea, la pensamos desde Francia, porque Chile, sí, es muy francés. Eso significa muchas cosas, pero también significa una visión de mundo. Y evidentemente esa visión de mundo va a tener que ver con una visión que va a tomar un poco la línea del socialismo, sin duda. Pero hay dos ilustraciones. Una ilustración francesa, que ahí tenemos a Rousseau, a Voltaire y a todo ese grupo de iluminados por la luz de la razón. Y esa ilustración escocesa se va a dar debido a la reforma que se va a dar tempranamente en Escocia, una reforma de corte calvinista que va a poner el foco en la educación. Hay que entender que para la época de Adam Smith, Escocia tenía 4 universidades, mientras que Inglaterra tenía 2. Lo que no es menor, porque efectivamente esa ilustración escocesa de la última mitad del siglo XVIII va a manejar el Imperio Británico. Detrás de todo negocio y de todo comercio hay un escocés. Aquí en Chile también. Todos dicen, los ingleses de Valparaíso. Los socios de Portal eran los Gibbs, y los Gibbs no son ingleses, son escoceses. Siempre hay un escocés. Y por lo tanto tenemos que entender un periodo de cambio, un periodo en que efectivamente la revolución industrial, la aplicación del vapor, va a transformar el mundo. Porque lo que ustedes tienen que comprender es que antes del siglo XVIII, lo que primaba en el mundo era sí, un mundo muy igual. Es verdad, eran todos endémicamente pobres. Y cuando digo todos endémicamente pobres, los que tenían mucho también tenían poco. Si alguno de ellos, dueños de palacios, yo siempre me río, los palacios no tienen closet. No existía la sociedad de consumo, ¿ya? Porque no existía la posibilidad de producción industrial, eso primero. Pero no es solo la revolución industrial que va a comenzar en este periodo y que va a eclosionar en el siglo XIX, sino que son los inventos financieros que van a venir desde el siglo XVII, desde Holanda, y que se van a incorporar y que van a hacer que este escocés se pregunte qué hace rica a una nación. Por lo tanto, sí, es importante primero dimensionar desde el hoy que todo lo que nosotros damos por sentado que siempre fue, nunca fue. En la historia, sí, había pobreza endémica. Y no solo eso, no solo en lo económico, sino que también en la política lo que primaba para hacer política era la violencia física. Es decir, cuando nosotros vemos Game of Thrones, es real. La gente sí, se mataban entre ellos. Y cuando se decide hacer la democracia liberal como una solución, lo que se plantea es dejar fuera la violencia como una forma de hacer política. Por lo tanto, todo lo que nosotros damos por sentado es muy nuevo y es precisamente de este periodo. Y es en ese sentido que este personaje es fundamental de revisar. Y por eso, como Red Cultural, junto a CHLE+HOY, junto al Banco BICE, decidimos invitar a Chile a Jerry Muller. Jerry es uno de los biógrafos de Adam Smith. Pero además, él es un profesor de historia que se ha dedicado muchísimo a los temas de capitalismo, pero no solo de capitalismo, sino que él trabaja muchos temas que tienen que ver con visiones sociológicas, podríamos decir, que un poco iluminan lo que son las políticas públicas. Su biografía es extraordinaria, particularmente porque no solo habla de lo que hizo, lo que vivió Adam Smith, que por supuesto lo hace, sino que representa y trae a Adam Smith para explicarnos por qué es importante hoy. ¿Por qué estamos reunidos en esta sala 300 años después hablando de él? Ahora, yo creo que si uno se reúne 300 años después para hablar de él, es un alguien que al menos dejó un legado. Así que voy a dejar con ustedes al profesor Jerry Muller. Él es PhD de la Universidad de Columbia, profesor de la Universidad Católica de América de Washington, D.C., y es un profesor teórico no solo de Adam Smith, pero tiene varios libros relacionados con el tema, pero su visión de mundo en la conexión de macro cosas en las humanidades, porque las humanidades, cuando de pronto historiadores a mí me dicen yo soy historiador, pero no entiendo filosofía, yo los miro y le digo, perdón, no entendiste nada. Porque si uno no combina la filosofía, la historia tiene pensamiento, pero también tiene expresiones de ese pensamiento. Historia, filosofía, arte, literatura, música, están todos relacionados. La historia no es muerta, no está dividida en estancos. Y eso es algo que Adam Smith lo tenía claro y que el profesor...
Thank you. My Spanish is not as good as Magdalena's, so I'm going to be speaking in English, for which I apologize. Oh, and I see I'm up there in, I have a really big face up there. If I'd known that, I would have had plastic surgery before I came. But just, those are all the visuals that I brought, so you'll just have to listen to what I have to say about Adam Smith, who is actually a very interesting thinker, as Magdalena has already touched upon, and as I'll try to expand upon now. So Adam Smith was born in Scotland in 1723, 300 years ago. That's why we're celebrating this anniversary. And he died in Scotland in 1790. He wrote two famous books that Magdalena has already referred to. The first, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, was first published when he was a young man in 1759, and he continued to revise that book throughout his life. The book for which he's most well known nowadays is, of course, the book called an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations, which he published in 1776, that is to say, 247 years ago. That's a long time ago, and yet people are still reading The Wealth of Nations and learning from it. Why is that? Well, the reason that Adam Smith has been read for 247 years and should be read today is that he's probably the greatest social scientist ever. Greatest in the range of topics to which he applied his mind, and greatest in his ability to look at the messy complexity of reality and to find general patterns in human life. So today I want to focus not about what Adam Smith thought about particular subjects in 1776, what he thought about tariffs or educational policy in Great Britain in 1776. And I'm not going to talk, at least directly, about many of the really interesting and important and controversial economic and political issues discussed in contemporary Chile, which I've been reading and talking to people about with great interest. But rather, what I want to do today is recapture how Adam Smith thought, which I think remains very much relevant for today. So the first thing to know about Adam Smith, which Magdalena has mentioned already, is that he was a professor of moral philosophy. The second thing to know is that he was an advisor to politicians in Scotland, in London, and in Great Britain. And the third thing that's worth knowing is that after he finished The Wealth of Nations, he spent much of the remaining decade and a half of his life as a government official, as the Commissioner of Customs for Scotland. In other words, one of the main officials involved in raising money for the British government. Now, his first book, that book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, was about the social and psychological processes by which people develop morally. That is, how they develop a sense of conscience and how they develop a sense of concern for others. Smith tried to develop that sense of concern for others in his writings. But he thought that our concern for others and our willingness to sacrifice on their behalf couldn't be equal and universal. We tend to care most about ourselves, about our families, about the people who are closest to us, and about those who we know. But we don't know everybody. In fact, we actually know very relatively few people. And so the question is, how can we have mutually beneficial relations with the many people who we don't know, who we don't care about intensely in the way that we care about those who are closest to us? And one set of such relations, which Smith focuses on in The Wealth of Nations, is through the market, through the people from whom we buy the things that we want and to whom we try to sell our labor, our services, or our products. That's the subject of The Wealth of Nations, which is primarily about the sort of relations that are based primarily on self-interest. But Smith did not stop being a moral philosopher when he wrote The Wealth of Nations. On the contrary, Adam Smith was deeply committed to alleviating poverty. He wasn't particularly concerned about inequality, but he was very concerned about eliminating poverty. The Wealth of Nations, for any of you who have looked at it, you'll notice it's not a book about how to get personally rich. It's not a book about personal wealth at all. It's not a book written for merchants or manufacturers or businessmen. It's a book written for people who are concerned about the public good, or what we might today call public policy. And its main goal was to try to specify the institutions to create a society of what Smith called universal opulence. That's an unusual phrase and not only in contemporary English, but even in 18th century English, universal opulence. By that, Smith meant a society in which as many people as possible would be materially better off because they were able to buy the things that they needed at prices that they could afford. So opulence means being materially well off. Universal means as many people as possible. Early in this big book, The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith shows how people who are relatively poor in a rich society can be materially better off than the rich people in a poorer society. I think he wanted to show here at the beginning of The Wealth of Nations that people tend to take the advantages of the market economy for granted. They see its flaws, and as we'll see, so did Adam Smith. But they often aren't aware or aren't sufficiently aware of how the market economy provides a lot of the good things that they already have and that they take for granted. And there's a passage early in The Wealth of Nations in which Smith describes the woolen coat worn by a day laborer in contemporary England. That is, a day laborer, that is somebody who's sort of on the lowest part of the socioeconomic ladder, who does work and make wages, but the lowest wages that are typically paid in that society. And he takes this object, the woolen coat, which you really need in England and even more so in Scotland to keep you warm, and he deals with the question of how many people are involved in the process of providing that, what we take to be a simple woolen coat, to this relatively poor man in what was at the time a relatively rich society. And Smith describes, it's a very long paragraph, I'm just going to summarize. He describes the shepherd who raises the sheep from which the wool comes, the man who sorts the wool, since the wool is dyed, the person who dyes the wool, the people who spin the wool and who weave the wool. And since the dyes come from far away, Smith describes the sailors on the ships that bring the dye from distant countries in Asia. And many more people who are involved in providing this woolen coat. And Smith describes all this to call attention to the fact that we tend to take for granted the advantages provided to most people in a market-oriented or commercial or capitalist society. And that those who focus on the gap between the rich and the non-rich may fail to appreciate just how well off the non-rich are as well. And that error might be true in our day as well as in Smith's day. To make this more tangible, I mean, a woolen coat doesn't sound very interesting, and this was 247 years ago. To make this all tangible and sort of bring it up to date in your mind, let me take that famous passage about all the people involved in providing the poor man's woolen coat and update it for contemporary circumstances. So if we were to update that part of Adam Smith, it would sound something like this. Analyze the possessions of an average office worker or cashier in Chile, and you'll discover that there are thousands and perhaps millions of people who have contributed in some small way to her worldly goods. The smartphone, for example, which she uses, has been produced by thousands of men and women from around the world. The miners who mine the quartz from which the silicon is extracted, the factory workers in South Korea who purify the silicon for use in the integrated circuits and transistors, the engineers in the manufacturing plants in Taiwan in which the semiconductors are produced, the lithium, cobalt, manganese, and nickel used in the batteries, which could be mined in Chile or China or the Democratic Republic of Congo, the liquid crystal display manufactured in South Korea, the facility in Vietnam where the phones are assembled, the crews of the container ships on which they're transported to the ports of Chile, the truckers who deliver them to retail stores, the salesman who provides them to the customer. Were we to examine in the same manner all the different accessories and services associated with the cell phone, the protective case that shields it, the charging cables that power it, the wireless earbuds that provide audio, the apps that run on it, and all the various parts that compose the cellular network infrastructure, we would find an even greater variety of people involved. If we examine all these things, we will come to appreciate that without the assistance and cooperation of many thousands, made possible through the web of capitalist exchange in an advanced capitalist economy, even a very average person would not have many of the possessions and services that they take for granted. Compared perhaps with the grand homes of Bill Gates or the private planes of Elon Musk, her standard of living no doubt appears simple. Yet it may be true that the cashier's clothes, appliances, and other worldly goods are greater than that of most people in the world only 1 or 2 generations ago. That so ends my update. Now, in the interests not only of honesty, but of demonstrating the remarkable nature of contemporary capitalism, I should note that I wrote that last long paragraph about all the people involved in creating the cell phone with the assistance of ChatGPT-4. For a few dollars a month, I now have at my fingertips the equivalent of a room full of research assistants. That's a small example of the way in which so many walks of life continue to be revolutionized by the dynamics of contemporary capitalism, a theme to which I'll return near the end of my talk. Now, you'll notice that the thousands of people on whom we depend to provide our smartphone are not people who we know. For the most part, we don't even know who they are or that they even exist. So our relations with them can't be based primarily on altruism. That is, it can't be based primarily on our concern for their welfare, because we don't know who they are. Instead, our relations with them are based primarily on self-interest. Our self-interest in getting the things that we want, and their self-interest in providing us with the things that we want. But how is it possible that relations based on self-interest can lead to socially positive outcomes, to that universal opulence that was Adam Smith's aim in The Wealth of Nations? The answer, one of the answers, is what Adam Smith referred to as the invisible hand of the market. Now, this is a phrase that's often misunderstood. People think it refers to some mysterious force or to the influence of God or what have you. But it doesn't refer to any of that. The invisible hand is a metaphor, and quite a brilliant metaphor when you come to appreciate it, for what Smith was trying to convey. If we translate Smith's famous metaphor of the invisible hand into plain language, it refers to the unintended positive consequences of social action. And this theme of unintended consequences, positive and negative, was perhaps Smith's central theme in The Wealth of Nations and one of his most enduring contributions to social science, to thinking about the social world. So though the image, that metaphor of the invisible hand, appears only once in The Wealth of Nations, it's clear that Smith saw it as a recurrent pattern in human affairs. So, again, in The Wealth of Nations, the invisible hand is a metaphor for the unintended, socially positive consequences of individual actions that are motivated by self-interest in a competitive market economy. You'll see in a moment why I emphasize competitive market economy. Now, Smith isn't claiming, or doesn't claim, that the pursuit of self-interest always leads to socially positive outcomes. In a moment, you'll see cases in which it doesn't. And he's not claiming that people who try to promote the public interest never do so. It's rather that under the right institutional conditions, self-interest may lead to socially desirable outcomes. Arguably, the wealth of nations and much of the subsequent history of economics is an exploration of the conditions under which self-interest leads to socially desirable outcomes and the conditions under which it doesn't. There are at least 4 great models of unintended consequences in the wealth of nations. Unintended consequences, positive and negative. And I want to focus on these examples as what I think is the most important thing to be aware of if you're trying to think like Adam Smith. The first of these models deals with the relationship between individual motivation and social outcomes. And it has to do with specialization and trade, or what in Smith's day was known as the division of labor. Smith shows how self-interest, that is, a desire to better one's condition, leads people to trade with each other, that is, to market exchange, and that market exchange makes possible a greater division of labor. It makes possible, that is to say, makes it possible for people to specialize. And that specialization also tends to increase innovation, and it certainly increases productivity. He famously uses the example near the beginning of The Wealth of Nations of a pin factory, in which you have 10 men in a factory along what we would now call an assembly line, where one of them takes the rod of metal and pulls it out and straightens it, and a second one cuts it, and a third one forms the head of it, and a fourth one puts the head on the pin, and another one takes the pin and wraps it in paper, and another one takes that wrapped pin and puts it in a box, and so on. And Smith shows that if each of those 10 men had to make the pins by themselves, individually, by themselves, they would be able to make a small number of pins each day. But through this process of the division of labor, that is to say, through the process of specialization, each of those people gets particularly good at their task and sometimes innovates in that task, and the net result is that they can produce, the 10 people can produce thousands and thousands of pins a day. So self-interest leads to market exchange, and that market exchange makes it possible for people to engage in specialization. And Smith, by the way, uses this example of the pin factory not because he was trying to show the superiority of factory labor, but because he says this is a larger process going on in society as a whole, the process of increasing specialization and increasing productivity that occurs through the expansion of market activity. It's just that this image of the pin factory makes it very sort of clear and tangible in people's minds. So it's this process of trade based on self-interest that leads to the division of labor, greater specialization, and greater productivity. And that greater productivity means that more goods can be produced more cheaply so that more people might be able to buy them. So for Smith, that's an example of a positive unintended outcome. Okay? On the one hand, none of the people involved in this process are concerned about universal opulence. They're not concerned about making it possible for more people to buy more things. They're motivated by their self-interest. But when the self-interest is channeled through the proper institutions and the proper incentives, it can lead to positive social outcomes. In this case, greater productivity. But that still raises, and Smith points out that the more people who are involved in the market, that is to say, the more people who are engaged in trade, the greater are the possibilities of specialization, innovation, and an increase in productivity. That was his main argument in The Wealth of Nations, not only for freer trade within a country, but also for freer international trade between countries that would create ever larger markets, more and more people involved in this productive process. Now, all of this explains how the goods can be made more efficiently. But why should the goods that are produced by specialization and trade be sold at cheaper prices? Right? That brings us to Smith's second great model in The Wealth of Nations, the model of the competitive market. For those goods to be available to as many people as possible, people have to be forced to channel their self-interest through the market. The market has to be competitive. That is, it has to be as open as possible to free entry by workers, by owners of land, by merchants and manufacturers. And Smith points out that to the extent that laws or social practices make it difficult or impossible for people and firms to compete freely, to freely sell in the market, then the cost of goods will go up and fewer people will be able to afford them. But when the market is free and competitive, Smith shows, and I won't go through all the stages, over time in a competitive market, prices tend to go down to the lowest level at which some good can be made under contemporary circumstances, under contemporary technological circumstances. And driving down the price so that more people can afford these goods is what Smith meant by universal opulence. So the competitive market is another example of the invisible hand, of the positive, unintended effects of social action. Again, none of the people involved in this market activity, in this competitive market activity, they're not in it because they're trying to improve society. They're not in it because they're trying to improve the well-being of the great bulk of people. They're in it because they're pursuing their own self-interest. But if that self-interest is properly channeled, then it can produce socially beneficial results. And it's that notion of institutions that channel self-interest in certain directions that Adam Smith means by the invisible hand. It's as if there was some hand pushing the people involved in market activity to engage in a process, the ultimate results of which can be very socially positive in terms of making possible universal opulence. So far, it's a very rosy picture of self-interest and how it can lead to socially positive consequences. But it's, as Smith points out at great length, and this is the third model in The Wealth of Nations, it's in the interest of individual workers or groups of workers, of individual owners, of corporations, of businessmen, of merchants, and so on, to try to prevent market competition for their labor or for the products that they're manufacturing or for the products that they're selling. And Smith describes in The Wealth of Nations how merchants collude with one another. That is, they get together for what seems like a social occasion, and they actually conspire to keep prices high. Or if they're workers, they conspire to keep wages high. And all of these people use various means to influence politicians, to adopt legislation that prevents the free market by import duties and in many other ways. And so it's in the interest of individuals and of groups of people to try to impede the competitive market process that leads to lower prices and that makes goods more affordable. So in this third model, the one I've just referred to, the pursuit of group self-interest creates negative unintended results for society as a whole, right? The merchants who organize and get the government to adopt legislation that reduces competition for their goods, they're not really concerned about social well-being, they're concerned about themselves. And in this case, being concerned about themselves, their self-interest leads to negative social consequences. Again, because they're not forced by the invisible hand, that is, by the institutions of the market, to engage in competitive activity. Looking for a moment from Adam Smith's day to ours, we see that the tensions between maintaining capitalist competition and attempts to circumvent or eliminate that competition are in no way diminished as society becomes more democratic. Those tensions just take new forms. Now it's not just merchants and manufacturers, but unionized workers in the private sector and in government as well, who try to, again, eliminate or diminish or circumvent market competition. And then Smith's fourth model, and this is the last one I'll discuss in The Wealth of Nations, involves the unintended negative effects of even well-functioning competitive markets. Now, to understand what Smith is saying about this, keep in mind that Smith was writing in the third quarter of the 18th century in Great Britain at a time when most children did not go to school, right? They were at home till they were 7 or 8, and then they would go to work in the factory or in the farm. And he returns in The Wealth of Nations, near the end of the book, to discussing those people working in the pin factory. Those people who, through the division of labor made possible by the market, become more specialized. They become more efficient, they become better at what they're doing. But he says, think about the mind of a person who hasn't had schooling, who goes into a factory at the age of 8 and spends most of his working life, putting the head on a pin, hour after hour, day after day. Smith says that process is mentally dulling, right? It constricts the person's ability to think about larger issues in the world. Now, as so often in The Wealth of Nations, Smith describes problems and tries to come up with solutions, not utopian solutions, not ultimate solutions, but what are the best solutions that could be found in that society at that particular time. And Smith says what government ought to do is it ought to provide what we would call primary public education for everyone, so that everybody learns how to read, how to write, how to do basic mathematical calculations. And it can do so by providing schools, most of which the government should pay for, but the parents should pay a little bit of the fee, Smith says, to make sure that the teachers are actually doing their jobs properly. So again, I'm not saying that this is the ultimate solution, but it was at the time when Smith suggested it in 1776, this was really quite a radical idea in England and in continental Europe, the idea that government should make sure people get basic education. And so this is this is an example of some of the unintended negative effects of even a well-functioning competitive market. And today we might point to things like environmental damage as one example of the many such unintended but anticipatable effects of market activity. So the theme of unintended consequences is the leitmotif, the grand theme of The Wealth of Nations. As we've seen, sometimes those consequences are positive, as when the market can be made to lead to universal opulence. Sometimes the unintended consequences are negative. It's because of the demonstration of the variety of unintended consequences of social action that I think The Wealth of Nations is the great training manual of public policy. For the role of intellectuals who seek to influence public policy is to try to anticipate the unintended results of proposed measures, from forms of taxation to labor and environmental regulations to the benefits and pitfalls of one or another kind of industrial policy. Nowadays, some conservatives and libertarians have adopted Smith's belief in the unintended socially positive outcomes of the market as their guiding rule, along with the belief that the unanticipated that the unintended consequences of government tend to be negative. Conversely, many leftists tend to overlook the negative unintended consequences of government action. They too often accept good intentions as a substitute for good policy. But of course, good intentions, altruistic intentions, do not guarantee good results. Now, this notion that self-interest can lead, under the right conditions, to socially positive results makes a lot of people uncomfortable. It seems counterintuitive to them. After all, everybody in this economy is out to pursue their own self-interest. How can that be socially beneficial? It makes them uncomfortable because if they're preachers or if they're a certain kind of Kantian moralist, they place a great deal of emphasis on intentions rather than on the results of actions. I think that both the conservative libertarians and the sort of anti-capitalist leftists depart from Adam Smith's program of trying to cultivate men and women of public spirit who would be moved to participate in government. People who, with the help of social scientific knowledge of the kinds of recognition of patterns that I've been describing, would recognize both the role of market mechanisms in securing the greatest public good and recognize the importance of an extensive framework of public services provided by government. So the Wealth of Nations is divided into 5 books. The largest of those is about the role of government and how to raise revenue through the right sort of taxes in order to make government possible, to do the sorts of things that Smith thought only government could do, to provide for national defense, to provide for the protection of property, to provide a judicial system to adjudicate the kinds of conflicts that would necessarily occur in a capitalist society, to provide infrastructure of various sorts that couldn't be efficiently provided by the market. So that's why it made sense that after Smith finished The Wealth of Nations, he went to work as Commissioner of Customs for Scotland, a very important role at the time in raising government revenue, because he thought government needed revenue, but he was concerned to raise revenue as efficiently as possible and in a way that, that put the least possible pressure on the individuals who that revenue was going to come from. I've only been able to give you a little flavor of the insights and arguments of The Wealth of Nations. Despite Smith's remarkable breadth, Smith's remarkable breadth and insight, I think there were at least 2 areas where I think Adam Smith perhaps said too little. One is the role of entrepreneurial innovators, and the other has to do with self-interest. That is the motivation for making money in the first place. And here I think that the work of the 20th century Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter, who I think is perhaps the only social scientist who can rival Adam Smith in the range of his analysis, provides a useful complement to thinking about contemporary capitalism. Adam Smith had portrayed the process of commercial development as a gradual process of the improvement of the well-being of the mass of citizens made possible by the growth of capital and the improvement of productive methods, the sort of incremental improvement of the wealth of nation, of productive methods. Schumpeter, by contrast, described capitalism as a process of discontinuous leaps and bounds made possible by imaginative entrepreneurs who introduced new technologies, new products, and new methods of organization. Today, I think that emphasis on innovation remains relevant, both for thinking about individual entrepreneurs and for thinking about innovative organizations and companies. Economic historians typically nowadays make a useful distinction between what they call Smithian growth and Schumpeterian growth. Smithian growth, the kind of growth that Adam Smith described, is based, as I say, on trade and specialization. Schumpeterian growth is based on innovation, on risk-taking, and on research and development. Perhaps Adam Smith's background, together with his professorial inclinations, made him suspicious of risk-takers. And I think that's still the case among academic economists. Most radically, the French economist Thomas Piketty and his school, for whom the issues of innovation and growth are of no interest whatsoever. That is, they tend to take that kind of innovation and growth for granted while focusing on issues of distribution. Schumpeter pointed out that this process of innovation was what he called creative destruction. And it tends to get too little attention, I think, even today, from academic economists and philosophers and lawyers. And when it does get attention, the emphasis is more often on the destructive elements than the creative elements. Members of those professions, like the professoriate, tend to be risk-averse. After all, their highest aspiration is to get tenure. And that spills over into the government officials that they sometimes train. So academic economists and the public bureaucrats that they train tend to be suspicious of risk-takers and innovators. The second gap in Smith's thought concerns the motivation for engaging in economic activity. In The Wealth of Nations, Smith uses this term self-interest to describe the process that gets the whole process of trade and specialization and so on going. But he says little more about what self-interest means. And there's a tendency for people, not of Adam Smith, but for other people, to think that self-interest means selfishness. But people try to better their economic condition for many reasons. Some of them are selfish, but some of them have to do with wanting to support their families, their children, their grandchildren, for wanting to have time for leisure, to develop their minds, for wanting to make money to donate to causes that mean a lot to them. Could be the church, could be an art museum, could be some foundation or whatever. Smith, of course, knew that there was more to self-interest than just selfishness. But some subsequent generations of economists tend to forget that. I hope that you won't. And I hope that you see why 300 years after he was born, Adam Smith's ideas are still worth thinking about. Thank you.
Ahora vamos a abrir preguntas. A ambos lados va a estar la Bárbara y alguna de las niñitas con micrófono. Entonces, la idea es que levanten la mano y que se puedan acercar para tomar las preguntas de ustedes. Lo ideal es que quien haga la pregunta se ponga de pie, porque desde aquí es súper difícil ver de dónde están haciendo las preguntas. Entonces, uno como que escucha la voz nomás. ¿Hay alguien que va a hacer una pregunta? Allá. Ahí. Allá. Ah, bueno, ya.
Doctor Miller, buenas tardes, Juan Enrique Insunza. Desde la perspectiva de la mano invisible, y tal como usted ha sido estudioso durante todo este tiempo del señor Adam Smith, quisiera preguntarle, ¿qué cambio o qué modificación le podría hacer usted a los modelos que él representa o lo dejaría de la misma manera?
Yeah,
Muchas gracias.
And the perspective of the invisible hand, what change would you do from today of the theory of Adam Smith, or would you let in the same way?
That is a big question. Under the perspective of the invisible hand, what sort of suggestions would Adam Smith have made for today, and what suggestions would I make for today? I'm not going to get into specifics, because one of the things that Adam Smith was aware of is that even if, especially really, if you knew these general rules, these general patterns of what tends to make society wealthier and less wealthy and better off and less well off, you always have to apply them to particular circumstances, not just to the particular economic circumstances of the country, but the political circumstances of the country. And Smith says something very interesting. He says at one point in The Wealth of Nations, it has to do when he's discussing eliminating duties, that is, eliminating payments that you had to make on imports. He says, if you eliminate these, you're going to hurt certain groups in society. You're going to hurt the groups who have profited from these kinds of regulations. And he says, I as a social scientist, I can tell you that it's a good thing for society as a whole. I can tell you it's going to hurt certain groups, at least in the short term. But to know how far you can go in that policy, that depends, he says, on the kind of specialized knowledge that only politicians have. And so, while there are broad things that I could say about the benefits of freer international trade and freer internal trade, and having government agencies that help to combat collusion among businessmen, so antitrust sorts of policies, and having policies that don't allow labor unions to monopolize a particular area of the economy. All of those are general rules that I think I would advise, but how far one can go in any given country at in any given set of circumstances depends on knowing a lot about the particular political dynamics of that country at a particular time.
Acá, allá hay una pregunta. Allá.
Hi, good afternoon, and thank you first and foremost. I wanted to ask, with the danger of maybe being too specific, but why is the idea in economics of diminishing returns so so mainstream and widely accepted, if maybe division of labor and precisely the evidence of human history have proven that we've had increasing returns in labor and capital throughout the years, maybe even dating to the ideas of Adam Smith. So through this division of labor and so on. So where's the issue, or how was this contradiction born?
Okay, so the notion of diminishing returns is that as you add to a process of production, as you add more people or other kinds of resources, after a while, the productivity tends to decrease, and so does profitability, right? Now the thing is, the diminishing returns is true, except when you have innovation, right? So it's true that, if you have a copper mine, the first 100 years that you mine it, it's probably going to be very profitable, and then the deeper you get into the mine, the more expensive it's going to be to extract the copper, And so you're going to have a process of diminishing returns. But if you have some kind of process where, I don't want to threaten the Chilean economy, but if you could replace copper with something else in making modern electronics or making environmentally friendly engines, then you could have a tremendous increase in value through innovation. Or if you could create some way of refining the copper much more efficiently, then you could have a process of increasing returns, right? So under certain circumstances, and those circumstances are true for lots of businesses and lots of times and places, there are diminishing marginal returns. But as I say, once you bring in this Schumpeterian emphasis on innovation, then it changes the game.
Que los que hagan la pregunta, por favor, se paren para poder verlo. Sí, ahí ya te vimos. Pero...
Aló, buenas tardes. Si tomáramos como referencia el ranking Heritage, que nombra los países más capitalistas que hay en el planeta, vemos hace tiempo que viene punteando Singapur, desde que China absorbió Hong Kong, que era el primer lugar, Singapur, Nueva Zelanda, Suiza, y tienen estos distintos sistemas sociales. Pero una coincidencia en términos del motor económico que es capitalista. ¿Cuál de estas sociedades se parecería un poco más al ideal de Adam Smith?
I don't know the answer to that. You know, the remarkable thing about places like Singapore is that they have a very strong, they had and they have very strong government. It wasn't for a long time particularly democratic, and it did develop a lot of policies that were focused on international trade, but also, in the way that Smith suggested, that were also focused on the education of the population, on what economists sometimes, in an awkward phrase, call human capital. I can't think off the top of my head of which countries would be the most Smithian, because again, Smith knew that you had to adapt these general rules towards the specifics of different populations in different countries.
Allá, acá. Where? Ahí.
First, thank you very much for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. Second, I would like to ask, what did Adam Smith thought on the redistributive role of the state? And basing ourselves on the ideas of Adam Smith, what would have he thought on what would have been the most suitable monetary policies according to his thoughts and ideas? Thank you very much.
Well, first I'll answer about monetary policy. Remember that in Adam Smith's day, there were still no central banks in most countries, including in England. So there were actually many forms of money circulating at the time in England as well as in many other countries. So the issues of monetary and policy and inflation and so on, those kinds of ideas that we typically associate with Keynes and with Milton Friedman, those are beyond the world that Smith lived in. In terms of government's redistribution, Smith was not primarily concerned, wasn't even much concerned with redistribution, except in the following sense. He thought, as I tried to indicate at the end, that government had many important functions, that it was important to do those as efficiently as possible, and to tax people as efficiently as possible. But he thought that on the whole, people who were richer in some ways benefited from government more than people who were poorer, and they should contribute a higher percentage of their income in taxation as a result.
Hola, mi pregunta es acerca de la conexión que hay entre las dos obras de Adam Smith, Teoría de los Sentimientos Morales y La Riqueza de las Naciones. ¿Estas obras son, a su juicio, complementarias o contradictorias? Porque hay mucha gente que toma Teoría de los Sentimientos Morales como una obra moral y, en opinión de muchos otros, él llega a la riqueza de las naciones a través del estudio de la moral. ¿Cuál es su opinión al respecto? Muchas gracias.
Yeah, so that's a very important question. What is the relationship between these two big books, The Theory of Moral Sentiments and The Wealth of Nations? It's important to keep in mind that Adam Smith wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiments before he wrote The Wealth of Nations and after he wrote The Wealth of Nations. That is to say, he first published it in 1759, he published The Wealth of Nations in 1776, and then he kept revising The Theory of Moral Sentiments till the year that he died, actually, till 1790. So Smith certainly didn't think that these were the products of two different minds or two different orientations. I think what he would say is that the books deal with, I think what he would say is two things. The books deal, as I tried to indicate a bit in my talk, with, in some ways, two different realms. The first realm is how we develop a sense of concern for others beyond ourselves. In fact, one of the first paragraphs of The Theory of Moral Sentiments says, no matter how selfish we imagine people to be, if we look at the world, we see that people are affected by the happiness and the sadness of others. And he goes on to explain at great length and with great insight why that's the case, how we come to care about others. But as I mentioned earlier, our care about others tends to have layers, right? We care most about the people close to us, perhaps about ourselves, or if there's somebody we really love, we care more about them than about ourselves. Think about our children, for example. And then we care somewhat less for the larger members of our family, and we care somewhat less, though we still care, for the other people in the community of which we're a part. And Smith says this is the way things are. Now, in The Theory of Moral Sentiments, he's both describing these processes by which people develop a sense of conscience and a sense of concern for others. And he's also trying to explain to you by example, as you read the book, why you should expand the range of your concerns. And why ultimately, if you're really, if you want to live on a higher moral and intellectual plane, you really should be concerned about people who you don't know at all. You should be concerned in his day about the people in China, for example, right? Now, so on the one hand, Smith is describing empirically, or what we might call phenomenologically, the social processes by which people become concerned about others. He's also, in The Theory of Moral Sentiments, as I say, trying to show you that it's actually a good thing to be concerned about others, that you're not a sucker for being concerned about others. That's actually a positive way to be. In The Wealth of Nations, he's writing about relations between people in the market who don't know one another, who by and large are not concerned about the welfare of other people, and trying to show how under the right circumstances that self-interest, if it's channeled in the right way, as I described, can lead to socially beneficial outcomes. Now, think of what I said at the beginning about the intended audience of the Wealth of Nations. The intended audience of the Wealth of Nations is policymakers, politicians, and the kinds of intellectuals who influence policymakers and politicians to try to get them more concerned about the common good, to try to get them more concerned about what Smith called universal opulence. And he's trying to explain to them how, if you understand these kinds of social processes, you can anticipate the unintended positive and negative effects of various kinds of institutions like the market. So The Wealth of Nations is written, as I say, if you want to make money, even though it has wealth in the title, there's no reason to read The Wealth of Nations. It has to do with the wealth of the nation as a whole and what you should think about and what you should do if you're interested in increasing the wealth and the well-being of the nation as a whole. So the answer to your very good question is that properly understood, there is no conflict and not even a tension between the theory of moral sentiments and the Wealth of Nations.
Thank you. You can hear me? It's working? It's working. Well, fantastic. Thank you very much for coming out, Jerry. It's wonderful to see you here. I've read a couple of your books in the past, and of course, the Weber thesis, the Protestant ethic, given Scottishness, Jewishness, overseas Chineseness, etc., etc. Is it valid?
So in 1905 to 1906, the German sociologist Max Weber published this book called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. He thought about the spirit of capitalism as basically the pursuit of self-interest, especially material self-interest. And he asked himself a couple of questions. Why did some countries become more capitalist earlier than others? And why did some groups in society, especially religious groups, become more capitalist than others? And he has a complex answer. He was above all interested in Calvinists because they were the largest major religious group that tended to be most involved in capitalist activity in the 17th century, which is really what he's writing about. If you think about the Huguenots in France or the Puritans in England, or if you think about the various Reformed, that is to say, Calvinist groupings in Germany, he shows that in his day, that is in 1900, there was a gradation of groups in terms of how wealthy they were and in terms of how much schooling they got. And he's talking about in Germany at the time. And the Calvinists tended to have the highest incomes and be most involved in market activity. The Lutherans had less income and were less involved, and the Catholics had even less income and were less involved in entrepreneurial capitalist activity. So he began with this contemporary observation and asked, what role could religion have played both in launching capitalism, so to speak, and in explaining why some groups in contemporary society are more active in capitalism than others. And he has a complex answer that the Calvinists believed in predestination. That is, that before you were born, God had already decided whether you were going to go to heaven and live in eternal bliss, or go to hell and live in eternal damnation. And he says that kind of message caused so much anxiety in people when they heard their preachers talk about this, that it led them to look for signs that they were saved, that they were among the redeemed and not among the damned. And he thinks that that psychological pressure led them to look for signs that they were redeemed and saved, and one of those signs for them was worldly success. But that it also went together with an ethic of being materially successful, but not spending the money, rather reinvesting it. And he thought that the Lutherans had less of this, and the Catholics had even less of it. But when you look at that original set of statistics that Weber was looking at about the different levels of economic and educational achievement of different religious groups, you see that the Jews, that are only about 1% of the population of Germany, were radically overrepresented in terms of the amount of education that they got, and in terms of their engagement in capitalist activity, and in terms of their level of wealth at the time. Weber has a not very convincing explanation of why he's going to ignore that fact. I mean, he would say that that might be true about the Jews, but they weren't as involved in launching capitalist activity in the 17th and 18th centuries, which certainly has an element of truth to it. But for a variety of reasons in the European world, Jews tended to be disproportionately successful in capitalist economic activity. There's lots of reasons for that. One of them has to do with the fact that poverty was never considered to be a virtue in Judaism. It also very much has to do with the fact that in medieval Europe, Jews were considered outside the community of Christian civilization. They were tolerated because they were supposed to recognize Christ when he came back at the end of time, but they were to be marginalized and persecuted, and they weren't allowed to own land. They weren't allowed to engage in many kinds of artisanal activity in guilds and so on. Jews were usually excluded from the guilds. And so they tended to be engaged in market activity, in buying and selling, and also a small percentage of them, but it was important for the way in which Christians thought about Jews, a small percentage of them were engaged in the lending of money at interest, which in medieval Christianity was considered to be a sin. But Jews were allowed to do it because they were damned anyway. Right? Now, that was the logic of the theological position. In fact, lots of Christians, including monasteries, were involved in lending money at interest, but that wasn't sort of officially legitimated. So Jews were allowed to lend money at interest, and there was an idea going back to Aristotle that influenced the way in which a lot of people thought about finance. Aristotle said, money is unproductive. Money can't produce anything. And so if people make a profit by lending money, that is something unnatural. And medieval Catholic theologians drew upon Aristotle and drew upon some passages in the Hebrew Bible that said you shouldn't lend money to your brother at interest. And they put those two things together, and they said lending money at interest is sinful, right? But again, Jews can do it because they're very sinful anyway. Now, what interested me in that book is that many modern European intellectuals, and then intellectuals beyond Europe, picked up on this idea that money is fundamentally unproductive. And what's really productive is labor that produces sweat, right? So if you're working in the field and you are engaged in physical activity, or if you're working in the factory and you're engaged in, your muscles moving around, then you sweat, then you're really working. That's the real source of productivity or economic value. And money that's now called capital, that is money that is invested to make it possible for those people to work in the factory or whatever, that's fundamentally unproductive. And so if the people who have the capital are making profit, they must be stealing it from the workers who are sweating. And that is Marxism. I mean, that's the core of Marxism. So it takes all these negative views of commercial life, and especially of financial life, that traditional Christians had assigned to usury, to the lending of money at interest, and to the Jews, and he applies it to capitalist society as a whole. So all the negative things that Christian theologians had said about Jews and their economic activity and its supposed unproductivity were then taken by Marx and extended to capitalism as a whole. Now, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, the premise that only labor that produces sweat really produces value happens to be untrue, right? It's the labor theory of value that's the basis of Marxism. It happens to be untrue. It turns out that people who think about how to invest their money are also doing something that's economically useful. But that was why in the first chapter of that book on capitalism and the Jews, I talked about the long shadow of usury, how this idea that money is unproductive was then extended in modern ideologies. So those are some of the things that Weber was concerned with, and some of the interesting things that he left out by not considering the Jews very much.
Vamos a abrir la última pregunta, que está por allá, parece. Ahí.
Mr. Muller, I have the question to ask you, how can we do the young ones and not the so young to protect the legacy of Adam Smith between not so friendly environments to those ideas of liberty and free economy?
So the first thing I would say is not to put so much emphasis on liberty and not to put so much emphasis on the free economy. Because it's true that Adam Smith was in favor of a relatively free economy, and it's true that he did value liberty, but he valued a lot of other things too. Above all, as I say, universal opulence. He was concerned about liberty in another sense that is connected with capitalist activity, and that is, he knew that there were many forms of labor at the time that were unfree. For example, slavery, which existed, of course, in the New World and in the Caribbean. In much of Europe at the time, labor often took the form of serfdom. That is to say, peasants who were tied to the land, who were controlled by the lord who owned the land, and who had to work for the lord a certain amount of time. So Adam Smith thought that the movement away from slavery and away from serfdom towards wage labor was actually an important improvement in people's lives in terms of liberty and giving them more control over their lives. In that sense, he was concerned with liberty. He was concerned with liberty, he certainly was. But when you just talk about liberty and the free market, I think you miss a lot of what I was trying to say about what Adam Smith was trying to do in The Wealth of Nations, which is how to adopt economic policies that are best for most people in a country in a particular time. So I would say the first thing is to try to explain the message that I've been trying to convey, which, as I say, I just take from Adam Smith. These aren't my ideas, I'm just a ventriloquist here for Adam Smith. To take those ideas in their fullness and try to expose people to them.
Bueno, para cerrar este evento, quiero invitar al escenario a Mauricio de la Maza, gerente de Altos Patrimonios de BICE Inversiones, que quiere compartir unas palabras con ustedes para luego invitarlos a continuar conversando afuera.
Hola, muy buenas noches a todos. La verdad que estamos muy contentos con la convocatoria de hoy. A nombre de Banco BICE y BICE Inversiones, queremos agradecerle a la Fundación Teatro Municipal de las Condes, a la directora ejecutiva de la Red Cultural Magdalena Mervilá y por supuesto agradecer la increíble presentación del profesor Jerry Muller. Ha sido un gran honor para nosotros recibir esta invitación y podernos sumar a este encuentro que conmemora los 300 años del legado de Adam Smith. Agradecemos sinceramente el esfuerzo y la dedicación en la organización de este evento tan interesante y entretenido. También, a nombre de Banco BICE y BICE Inversiones, queremos agradecer especialmente a todos ustedes que nos acompañaron hoy día en este evento y por lo mismo los quiero invitar a continuación cordialmente a un vino de honor junto a la Viña Tres Palacios para que podamos seguir compartiendo y disfrutando de este momento y será hasta una próxima oportunidad. Muchas gracias a todos.
En en